top Ukraine military commander says its forces now control nearly 390 square miles of Russia's neighboring Kursk region. In a surprise offensive, Ukraine caught Russian forces off guard, surely embarrassing for Russian President Vladimir Putin.
According to the Associated Press, Russian forces are scrambling to the incursion site, which started last week. Tens of thousands of Russian civilians fled Kursk as Ukraine's military moved in. So, will Ukraine's offensive make a difference in its war with Russia? Joining us now to discuss is Jason Beardsley, a senior advisor at Concerned Veterans for America, and also the director of Veterans Initiatives at Stand Together. Thank you for coming back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So this new offensive by Ukraine caught a lot of people by surprise, including apparently the Russians. What difference, if any, is this going to make in the war effort?
So it's a really good question. Of course, the penetration into the Russian territory not only was a ploy by the Ukrainians, but I think part of that is an indication that they're looking for a way to secure victory or some modicum of victory before a negotiated settlement. They know that this ends at the negotiation table. So if they did not do anything to change the lines, which have been stuck for months, defensive lines along border regions that they are unable to take back, they had to do something different to change the calculus at the table. So I think they took a gamble. They used some of their more professionalized forces, and now they're in something of a vulnerable position with extended lines into Russia, which is not actually the best position to be in for a military offensive. But understanding what was at risk here, I think it was a political gamble.
Now, I was listening to BBC this morning. It sounds like Russia's position is still that they are liberating Ukraine from neo-Nazis rather than trying to fight an imperial war here. How does Ukraine taking swaths of land that are Russian land, how does this complicate the message of Ukraine in their war with Russia, their defense against the Russian invasion? And how does this complicate or maybe benefit Russia's messaging?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The actual Russian narrative becomes a little bit easier for Moscow to talk about what they're doing to defend their own people. The initial setup about the usage of neo-Nazis to justify this invasion, of course, is a little bit of pomp and circumstance. But at the end of this, where Ukraine is going to lose some benefit is that now they're going to be staring at having to defend this incursion from an envelopment, which is where the Russians can come in and cut off that line to the supply lines back to Ukraine if they're smart about that, and that's not hard to do. So there's a real limit to how long they can sustain this incursion. But if they're smart and they suggest that this is capable, something they have capacity to do, again, this will play benefit to them as it relates to senior partners outside Ukraine. That's the United States, it's Britain. They needed to show something of success here. And so what they're trying to do is just change the calculus, and it was stuck in these lines of defense. So this won't make it easy in the long run, but this was a gambit to make it easy in the near term. And I think they've done that well.
Well, does it open up the potential for a negotiated peace arrangement under more favorable terms for Ukraine now that they occupy some kind of Russian territory? Is now not the time to go to the table and say, let's end this conflict? Or is the opposite going to happen? They're going to feel almost cocky that, look, we were able to turn the tables, and now Western nations should provide us with even more support, and we can really win this conflict, evict Russia from the country, when that's probably not the case long term. And now would be an ideal time to go to the bargaining table and end this horrific conflict.
I think that's a really sharp observation, because this can go both ways here. To your point, if they were to immediately seek for a settlement, this might provide an advantage for them for a moment, but that advantage will not last long. And again, now they become, this is a double-edged sword, because it becomes a vulnerability to defend that terrain outside of your logistics base, which is lines of communication, it's roads, it's material, it's food, it's fuel, it's all the things you need to move an army. An army moves on its stomach, as they say. So if you can't sustain the military troops in there, the 10,000 troops inside this incursion zone, you can't hold that terrain. So if they don't make a move fast at the diplomatic table, they lose the advantage of what this was, which begs the question, what was this? And how did the Ukrainian Unified Command understand this part of their offensive maneuver? And I would suggest that a lot of this came down to not being able to move the lines on the ground. So they wanted to take something of a Hail Mary, up the left, if you will, and try something unique and different. But again, a lot of that may not play well on the ground for the forces, while it may play okay in the Western capitals. It's just a question of sustainment.
Now, of course, this isn't the only geopolitical conflict Russia's involved in. You have the Houthis of Yemen that have been attacking shipping, specifically ships going into Israel, aiming to target weapons and strategic shipments coming from the United States. Now, Israel responded with a strike in Yemen, and Russia, Putin specifically, entertained the idea of funding Yemen in their defense against Israel. How is what's happening in Ukraine impacted by potentially Russian strategic interests being pulled to the Middle East in this moment?
I think, again, that's another great observation that these wars happen between states in these proxy conditions, so that when the United States is funding the war in Ukraine and we have been the aggressor in many cases to sort of defend the Ukrainians against the Russians have moves that they can make through Yemen, through Hezbollah. They've had some changes over the past in how their disposition in the Middle East has been, and they've met with some resistance, as has the United States. But the danger here is that United States service members, military members, are in harm's way. We have bases, the recent attack on al-Assad, and places in Iraq and places in Syria still, where very small pockets of military U.S. service members are in harm's way. Meanwhile, we're moving naval assets into the region, which, if you like flexibility, if you like adaptability, the naval assets give you a lot of warheads in the region without putting U.S. soldiers and service members in harm's way. And we're seeing that too often, whether it was the tower in Jordan or al-Assad being attacked. I represent Concerned Veterans for America, and we have said this from the outset. An escalation in the Middle East is more dangerous if we have assets on the ground that they can leverage and manipulate against. And that's exactly what Putin is doing. So he's reacting and responding to the United States backing Ukraine by backing our enemies in the near Middle East. It's really a tragic situation of bad foreign policy all around.
And we're in a moment where I think the American people are not quite sure what the next administration's foreign policy will be, because if it's Trump, he hasn't been extremely specific. Obviously, there are many in the Republican Party's new coalition that want a less interventionist policy, especially in Europe, some as well in the Middle East. And he has kind of paid lip service to that, while also saying that he has such a relationship with Putin that Putin wouldn't do various things if he was in charge. Same for what happened on October 7th. And then on the other side, Biden's now going to be a one-term president regardless. Harris, if the Democrats win, it'll be Harris. And whether she will break with or have a different foreign policy than her former boss is not at all clear. She is not detailing a lot of policy differences either. The administration right now is emphasizing continuity, even though that is actually frustrating to a lot of her own base's activists. So what is this effect having on our allies and our adversaries or potential adversaries overseas, that we're in a moment now, I think, of profound uncertainty about what the foreign policy direction is going to be?
Right. A lot there to unpack. I think first and foremost, it's worth answering that last part first. Our allies overseas, or even our enemies, really see this moment as one of the reasons the United States is not a long-term stable, it doesn't have long-term continuity. Every election, there may be changes. They can see the different personalities that run the administrations. And they also can understand there's a growing consensus among the population, the base that you mentioned, sort of intimating that years of endless wars are not necessarily in our best interest. And that's how we feel as veterans who fought in two of these endless wars. So all of those things come to a head right around the election time and make this a very tenuous moment. That's why I think you're going to see more activity as we run into November, because post-November, you see what is going to be the policy. Joe Biden, for whatever it's worth, has come out of the Senate, had a lot of time in the foreign policy realm, spent a lot of time with State Department mentality and how to kind of conduct business overseas. So that was always part of his portfolio. And so when he took the reins, you could see a lot of decisions went down the State Department line. Kamala Harris does not have that background. She hasn't been a foreign policy. She doesn't have a real track record there. So what we don't know is what she'll bring to the table. And our enemies, our allies, know that. On the other hand, you mentioned other options, the growing base and consensus on the right, sometimes and the left are coming together to say, we think that endless wars are not in our interest. And again, I would just suggest that American veterans who did this for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan and saw our gains squandered on the battlefield are making our voices heard. Those questions are coming right to the Senate floor now, right to the congressional, lawmakers' offices. Like, what is the plan and how do we win? So we're looking for something to really fortify what is America's best interest. And if we can find that, I think we'll back whoever can bring that to the table.
Jason Beardsley, thank you so much for coming on and breaking this down.
Thanks for having me today.